So thank you all for coming today. Welcome to this panel discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We'll start with Jason. Jason Garcia, to my left here. His work documents the ever-changing cultural landscape of his home of Capoawingue, also known as Santa Clara Pueblo in northern New Mexico. Jason's Tewa cultural ceremonies, traditions, and stories, as well as 21st century popular culture, comic books and technology, influence his clay and his print work. Jason is also a master printmaker with a degree from University of Wisconsin, correct? Correct. And then Susan Kliewer. Susan is one of the Southwest's most acclaimed contemporary sculptors, a painter since the age of 10. Susan turned to sculpting in 1987 after working in an art casting foundry for 10 years. And then finally, Antonio Chavarria has over 30 years of experience collaborating with tribes and curating Native material culture. As curator of ethnology at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, he's curated many exhibitions of historic and contemporary Native art. So thank you all for coming today. Of course, the discussion today will focus on Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists' use of cultural symbols, the history of Indigenous representation in art, and the dynamics between the dominant culture and Indigenous artists who rely on their art for financial success. Because this is the last panel in this series, I don't know how many people attended the first series or watched the videos, but I thought it would be worth a very, very brief recap of what we covered in those panels, just so you understand kind of like where we've come so far. The first panel in the series really focused on blatantly fraudulent Native art in the marketplace on a global scale. And this relates to federal legislation, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990, which a lot of people aren't familiar with this legislation, but it actually protects both consumers and Native artists about what, especially jewelry, a lot of jewelry that is fraudulently made and labeled as Native made, but it's made in Pakistan or Indonesia or someplace like that. And so obviously this impacts legitimate Native artists in terms of their livelihood, but the marketplace has become flooded with this type of material in the last, I'd say 20, 25 years or so. And so the Indian Arts and Crafts Act really addresses that illegal market for counterfeit Native art. And really what we addressed in that panel was how this is not a victimless crime, right? If you buy a piece of jewelry and they say that it's Native made, but it's not, well, who's hurt? Well, the actual, the Native artists who are relying on that economic that stream for their economic stability, that's who it affects. And so there was a lot of details about the legislation. I urge you to go watch the panel. It's fascinating. The second panel in the series was called More Than a Meal, and the main theme of that panel was food sovereignty and indigenous foods, and who has the right to use these foods and these recipes, because of course, as Tony pointed out to me on the way down, you can't copyright an ingredient or a recipe even, right? And so it's a very different kind of cultural appropriation, but again, also has impacts on especially Indigenous people who are trying to bring back some of their traditional foodways. So again, not a victimless crime, but not really even a crime, but also, trends in the marketplace, trends in cooking have an effect on that access that Indigenous cooks and chefs need for their own survival. So what I saw as a common theme in the first two panels when talking about cultural appropriation is to focus on the power dynamic or the power differential between the two cultures, and to see, if there's a big differential in that power dynamic, that's when it becomes something that maybe should be questioned. So that's something to kind of keep in mind in any case of potential cultural appropriation. But I wanted to dial it back a little bit just to talk about appropriation in the arts. Of course, that's the name of the series, and I kind of was interested, like, what's the history of appropriation in the arts? And of course, we're talking about two forms of appropriation here: artistic appropriation and cultural appropriation. There's lots of other forms of appropriation, religious appropriation, that are related to cultural appropriation. But in the arts, Appropriation is a form of adoption, right? Appropriation is typically the use of pre-existing objects or images with little or no transformation applied to them. Use of appropriation in the arts has a long history in literary arts, visual arts, performing arts. In the visual arts, typically to appropriate something means to adopt, borrow, or recycle, or sample elements or entire forms of human-made culture. So an example of this would be, say, Andy Warhol's Campbell soup can. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, right? Andy Warhol did not invent the Campbell soup can, but he appropriated that image for his own artwork to interpret in a different way. Appropriation, similar to found object art, is, this is a quote from the MoMA Glossary of Art Terms, an artistic strategy, the intentional borrowing, copying, and alteration of pre-existing images, objects, and ideas. Now, I see cultural appropriation as typically broader than artistic appropriation. Artistic appropriation, I think, is a form of cultural appropriation, but it's essentially the borrowing of cultural elements, removing them, and reusing them outside of their original context. This is a process that could be consensual or non-consensual, right? And this is where the power dynamic and power differential kind of factors in. And finally, before we move on to questions with the panelists, I wanted to talk about a form, I think a concept that relates to cultural appropriation is a form of collective nostalgia. Nostalgia very much, I think, is a very powerful force that drives a lot of cultural appropriation. And anthropologist Renato Rinaldo came up with this concept of imperialist nostalgia, which is the imagined perception of colonized cultures, often with the paradoxical feeling of regret for what has been destroyed by the colonizer. So this type of nostalgia has led to stereotypes of indigenous people, such as the noble savage, stereotypes that you're probably familiar with, and efforts to basically save that which has been destroyed, right? Which is sort of counterintuitive. But we see this, going back to the turn of the last century, of people seeing the cultures that have been destroyed through colonization and trying to find ways, sometimes with very good intentions, but to save those cultures. A lot of museums in the Southwest have their roots in trying to preserve those indigenous cultures, right? So I think this continues to this day with different forms of cultural appropriation. Okay, so let's move on to questions for the panelists. And the first one I have is a very, very kind of broad question, but what are we talking about when we're talking about indigenous art? What does that mean? What does it mean? What does indigenous or native art mean? Tony?
Yeah, I guess so indigenous art, I guess to paint with broad strokes, if we will, is basically, art that is made by indigenous peoples, in the broadest term. Then to get a little more nuanced, is art made by indigenous people within a cultural context, if you will, as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean using strictly or with a native subject matter or iconography or such too, but basically coming from, like a sense in a cultural lens, basically how that cultural lens can have you interpret, other types of art. Whether if you're going to be using something that we use as a quote unquote traditional, whether that's ceramics or not, but but also that type of the art, are you using the traditional types of clays, whatnot too? Are you using commercials? Are you doing new methods of firing, whatnot? But how that is how your own, I guess, relationship and upbringing, with your, in a sense, indigenous culture influences that, in a sense. I guess so. Just for a quick taste version of what is indigenous art.
Well, I think he really said it all, but it can go way back to ancestors, and that's really worth preserving. And it's in every family of indigenous people. There's always someone who wants to do the art to keep it going and preserve the traditions of their culture, and I think it's wonderful. it's a lot more than a lot of us Anglos have, you know. We have different cultures where we came from, but we kind of lost it along the way a lot of times. So I'm really proud of these people that keep their arts and Indigenous ideas going through the generations.
Jay?
Just adding to what Tony said of you know, the Indigenous art made by the Indigenous peoples, and then also trying to define what is art exactly. Is it the craft? Is it the art? Is it in the museum? Is it something you're creating for utilitarian use? And then also, how does that definition become from, or changing from utilitarian use to being in a museum, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and selling for millions of dollars, or also materials, what it's made from? Those are some of those things that are attached to it. And then also the culture that creates it, and a lot of meaning behind it, whether it's a utilitarian or designs on the actual piece of work, and how that becomes quote unquote Indigenous. And then also, what is the meaning of Indigenous, of it being like natural, in its natural state? Like, how do you define all of that as well too, or being it raw in that sense? But again, it's also coming from a colonized mindset of saying, like, you guys are backwards because you don't have technology, you don't have certain tools that are Stone Age primitive. You know, that's also part of it as well too. So it has a lot of various different definitions. And then also in regards to appropriation, you know, stealing, taking, borrowing, adopting, acculturation. There's so many ways of carrying it, and I think those are some of the things that we're kind of talking about as far as Tony's notes and everything too. So,
Jason, as a native artist, I wanted to ask you specifically, how do you walk that line between seeing yourself as simply a contemporary artist, or defining yourself as an Indigenous artist? Do you kind of skew one way or the other, or do you find that a hard balance?
I don't know if it's like a hard balance. It's just who I am. That's my identity, you know. I'm an artist. I'm Santa Clara. I'm Tewa. I'm Jason. I'm Okupin. You know, I have this badge, this W on my chest that says I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm a hardcore Badger. I UNM alum also, and I guess there's a couple Badgers that I also met in the room as well too. So all Wisconsin. You know, so there's those identities of that, and also that of myself, of appropriating the fact that and that's who I've become, and that's who I am. And, you know, and again, being Tewa and being Santa Clara, you know, we have our own distinctive identity, which is also different from each of the other 6 Tewa Pueblos in New Mexico, and then also the Tewa group that's at First Mesa and Hopi. You know, we have connections, but we also have differences as well too that separate us over time as well too. So there's like really like a really hard, like there is no hard line. I always, or this is for myself, Jason Okupin, you know, it's just like this blend, you know, it's just something that doesn't necessarily detach. It's like concrete, you know, all these ingredients have made me who I am, and you can't never go back to water, concrete mix, sand, all those ingredients. It's a cake, you know, you can't break it back to, you can't take it back to an egg, you can't take it back to flour, you can't take it back to water, oil. You know, it's just, it's already concrete, you know, it's made. So it's really hard to say that of the line of how do you define artist, fine artist, contemporary artist. It also depends on the meaning of what I'm creating also as well too. Whether it is like utilitarian, or if it's a cultural item, or if it's something made specifically that I've been commissioned to make for a museum. So, you know, there's always those hard ways. How do you define it? It's always those things that you're always asking yourself that too.
I just wanted to say that I think Jason also brought up a very interesting point as well, that and how we define art, in a sense, in terms of Indigenous art, because many of the communities, certainly in the Pueblos as well, that there actually isn't a word for that, for art in traditional language. So if you're coming at it really from a strong cultural point, then it just comes from the outside, that as an artist, that's an outside thing, and then today too, and especially in today's the market all as well, then we can become like this artist. But I think that's also goes back to this root. So sometimes where this area about appropriation can be sometimes contentious is because that it's so tied to culture, because there wasn't like this kind of like split, where like the art was like separate from, it was a separate like occupation. And then even in terms of Indigenous as well, it's like I think back when the young a lady who won the Academy Award for, I think it's a Whale Runner, or Whale Runner or Whale Rider, was that?
Whale Rider.
Whale Rider. They're saying she's the first Indigenous woman to win an Academy Award. But I was thinking, but I think the year before, Catherine Zeta-Jones won for, was it Zorro or something? I think, and I believe she's Welsh. And it says, and so are Welsh Indigenous as well?
Yeah.
But it's not, what made me think too, is like, I don't think even Welsh would consider themselves Anglo, right? Correct? No, because they're Welsh.
Yeah.
And so it's like,
It says Irish don't consider
exactly.
themselves Anglo
They're not
for
Anglo
very
either,
reasons.
no, because they weren't those Anglos as the colonizers in a sense, yeah. So it's just like if you go to Wales, the signs are all going to be in Welsh as well with the English under it. It's because they still like maintain that identity. Because I think it's like here, well, sometimes people like there's a kickback to like are changing like place names, things like that as well. That's already happened as well. It's just finally like occurring here in this place.
Thanks, Tony. Why don't I throw the second question out here about, we're struggling a little bit, I think, sometimes with the definition of appropriation, a lot of interpretation about what people mean by appropriation. So I'd like to invite each of you to define, what is your own personal definition of what appropriation is, both in a broad sense, but also in the context of Indigenous art and culture. Susan?
The dictionary says that to take something for one's own use, whether you have permission or not. It was kind of sketchy about that. And it's a two-way street. It's a hard thing to define, really. I don't think you should use anybody else's images unless you ask them first. I know painters never would take, say, a landscape out of Arizona highways and paint it. I mean, you shouldn't do that. And sculptors also should have a model, and it should come from their heart and not copy somebody else, because that happens a lot. Somebody sent me a clipping once from a newspaper in Albuquerque, and some artist had used one of my sculptures and enlarged it for a big piece downtown Albuquerque. And their response when I called, it was a board that had chosen him, and they said, "Oh no, he made them Hispanic kids, not Navajo kids."
Oh no.
So I guess they thought that was okay, but everything about it was the same. There was even a dog running along the side of the burrow. I mean, anyway, I have different views on it. I think I get really upset about Anglo people doing Native people all like muscle men, like bodybuilders, because they don't really look like that. And most of the time, and especially in the old days, they were hungry. So there's things that bother me about artists and what they use sometimes. I try to be really authentic as much as I can, and I'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, appropriation definition of you do have your Webster's dictionary definition of it, and for artists, artists don't steal, they appropriate, and we were talking about that on the drive down of that's something that's been happening since time immemorial, since the cave drawings in Lascaux or whatever the place is, wherever it's pronounced, or sometimes talking with other artists, there where people say like, wow, you created such a great idea Or are you the first person, like you have to be the first native person to have put gold paint on ceramics? And they're like, no, you know. Or designs and saying like, wow, this is amazing. And it's like, oh yeah, the Greeks are doing it, you know. So it's really hard to define that in terms of art, you know. But I think then there comes into the question of the cultural appropriation, you know, because, you know, we're all influenced, again, like I said, by our own interactions, our own history, you know, or even sometimes, you know, appropriation and stealing can be the same thing. And, you know, for artists, it's very hard to, because, you know, you think of George Harrison, you know, my what is it, my Lord, my sweet Lord. But, you know, there's the Be My Baby song. And he's, what's I'm sorry? Oh yeah, He's So Fine. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the Wilson. Brian Wilson also had same thing, had issues with that, and you know, there's that memory of a song that's in their head. They write something, but then another artist says, "Hey, you stole that from me." They go to court. Sometimes they prove it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just art. It's just the identity. It's just, again, what we hear. But then you have other artists like, is it Dan Fogerty, you know? And it's like Run to the River, I think that's what the song is called, or Run to the Jungle. And then he has this song, and someone's suing him, but then, and they're saying or the other Eagles are suing him.
They accuse him of ripping off himself.
Yeah, so, you know, then that comes up too. So, you know, where he wrote a song when he was in the Eagles, 10 years later he writes it as a solo artist. His fellow musicians are suing him and say, how can I sue my own self? So again, it's really hard to prove some of these things, you know. But then when the cultural side comes into it, then that kind of changes things, you know. So I will talk more about it. It's huge.
Jason, I think you brought up a good point. When, you know, when we're getting into lawsuits and things like that, when money comes into it, that's when, you know, then people, because if any of those songs weren't hits, nobody would care, right? And you know, appropriation in music happens. It's been happening for years. You know, early hip hop, you know, people were sampling for records all over the place and not getting those cleared. They were not getting permission to use those samples. And nowadays you have to get those cleared. But back in the early days, like, people weren't getting those samples cleared. And I think a lot of people, you know, agree now in retrospect that was like a creative use of existing cultural elements. But, Tony, did you have a chance to talk about appropriation?
I think, you know, pretty much got it. Just with things, yeah. So but I think, you know, it's really different kind of what we're talking about, because there are those legal protections, you know, like copyright laws, trademark laws, etc. But then when you get into areas of, like, certainly of art and culture, then that's when it becomes a much more nebulous as well. I mean, because now there's been a big thing in the news recently, you know, about, you know, bringing copyright to the forefront again, is because of the Steamboat Willie, the first imagery of Mickey Mouse, now entering the public domain, you know, as well. And then they're talking about it now is that it's pretty close. For like, was it another 12 years, that the earliest versions of Superman, Batman, etc. are going to enter the public domain as well. But the thing is that you can't put out your own Batman comic. You can't call it Batman because then that's trademark, things like that. Just like the S shield insignia is trademark, which is different than from a copyright. So there's all these things that come up. But then when you get into what things we're talking about here, like on maybe either native iconography or something like that too, but then that's different, you know, completely things that falls more under, like, what is intellectual property, you know, what is appropriation, what is cultural or art appropriation.
The next question has to do with representation and Indigenous representation in art. And I was wondering if you guys could share some of your thoughts on the history of Indigenous representation in the art world.
Okay.
We know how that goes.
So Indigenous representation?
In art, yeah.
In art, yeah. Okay, well, I guess, yeah, you can take it back to, like, the earliest paintings or descriptions of the Picts and some of the other Biden Roman art and whatnot too. And basically anyone who wasn't civilized like they were, you know, and then them until they're, like, going through Europe and civilizing people as they saw it or whatnot. But And then certainly I can hear that you get these different eras of native native or indigenous representation of people in art, if you want to call it Western art. Starting back, in the earlier, you could even say that the Tempest, the Shakespeare's last play, is actually native representation. And if you want to call it a play, because it's influenced by the discoveries now coming out of what they consider the New World, and then some of those earliest paintings and such not that are starting to show up as well. But then what we're really focusing on is certainly in the Western period, with the post-Civil War, whatnot, and even the expansion of what was the United States, coming into these areas, what was formerly parts of either France or Mexico, and which was always still had the native people that were still here. That is one thing too, when you talk about, especially in this region, that they had already these established systems of government and such too. That one thing that's kind of a little less known is that certainly for a lot of Pueblo governments, that there was this issue back in the 1800s is that the people are saying, well, they're not really Indians because they're farmers and they have permanent houses and such, and so that they really don't belong under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then which was under the Department of War at the time as well. So that's it, because and they already had existing treaties with Spain, which then came under default under Mexico, which then defaulted under the United States. And so they weren't sure what to do with the Pueblos. So they were out of the Bureau for a while until they realized that there was nowhere else for them to go. Because then they started getting a little land loss because they weren't getting protections as well. The things were under trust and whatnot. So then they went back under the Bureau. So that you get these things like that are happening. So then I think maybe that also kind of relates to, as you mentioned, that imperialist nostalgia and whatnot too. So that's what what has happened. So you get this thing happening, this salvage anthropology happening in the 1870s. In 1879, Stevenson's coming out, and they're just collecting stuff. They're collecting stuff, and it goes into the early 20th century because they're saying these people are going to be gone. They're going to be gone in 20 years. They're going to be gone in 20 years. It's and it was always this 20-year thing. It was always being pushed back. They're gone in 20 years. They're gone in 20 years. It was like the 2-week thing back in the last election. 2 weeks, but this was always they're disappearing, and so then you start getting all these other types of expansions. People coming out and painting all these things what it was or even earlier with Catlin, as well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then then you got the guys like Remington, Russell, things like that as well. Where the thing is that it's a little different is that they're in that era. Certainly there's a cultural shift. Particularly among the plains, which everyone is that's kind of the dominant thing. It's because that was the end of that cultural thing. But as for example, for the groups around here, it just continued. They were farmers, and they were still farmers. It's just that I remember when the Depression hit in New Mexico, that really nothing changed because something like 90% of the population was in a economically depressed state already. So it was just everyone's like us now. So that, I'm kind of really going, I'm taking the wide U-turn to get back to the thing. But anyway, just to say that it's just it's always been there, and it's always been this process that's been tied to both the salvage anthropology in a sense, but you can even almost call it salvage art representation as well. Mm-hmm. That it's trying to capture something that they felt was either gone or disappearing. So.
Thanks, Tony. Mm-hmm. Susan?
Well, in some cases it has, especially on the East Coast. But I think people like George Catlin, he was here, 1836 or so, and he wanted to record the people that were here, and their customs and their clothing and their headdresses and all that. And nobody really objected to that. In fact, there's an artist living in Prescott now, John Coleman, some of you know him, really good sculptor and painter. He's taken Catlin's paintings and made them into sculptures. And they're beautiful. And he did them he used the paintings to get everything perfect in his sculptures. And you could see them down at the museum in Scottsdale, the Western Art Museum. So I think a lot of this is valuable to keep the traditions and the people, so we don't forget. Not that everybody's going away, especially the Pueblo people, but yeah, it's hard because you don't want people to take away from people that have their own symbols and their own art and all that. But at the same time, sometimes it's good for somebody to come along. Even Edward Curtis with his photographs. I mean, he worked like crazy to get all the tribes photographed. And he must have asked their permission because he posed them sometimes. And so it's hard. It's a hard question, I think. Mm-hmm. It really is.
Jason, thoughts about representation?
Yeah, I think early representations of Native peoples was pretty much part of the manifest destiny as far as, the westward expansion across America. Yeah. And then also in regards to, I think like Catlin and those other painters, you're documenting what you're destroying or will no longer be there. And then also thinking about the vanishing race of Curtis, Edward Sheriff Curtis, who's also from Wisconsin as well. And his ideas, and sometimes you have to think about that colonialist, settler colonialism that's taking place at that time. And again, the vanishing races, I'm documenting this because these people are no longer going to be there. And, let's not forget them. Let's document them before they're gone, just like Tony said with the salvage ideas. And, then there's also that other part, the thought of like, we have to document them before they go, before they're gone. But we haven't gone anywhere, we're still here. It's 2023. And, we've been here, or 2024, excuse me. See, I'm vanishing. And, we're still here. We're not going anywhere. We still maintain our tribal lands, like Tony said. We're still maintaining our languages, our cultures, despite colonialism over the past 500 plus years of Spanish, Mexican governments, U.S. governments, and I always say this in my talk of, we've gone through, 3 different colonizers. So who's next, after USA? And, because they haven't been along very, what is it? 200 plus years,
It was longer under Spain.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, we've learned to navigate various government systems and assert our identities, assert our land bases, assert our cultures. So, again, like I said, we're not going anywhere. So it's just interesting to see how natives are represented in art by a non-native audience.
Thanks. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to a couple questions further down. I want to get into this question of the boundary between appreciation and appropriation. And where do you guys see where that line is? Obviously, it's probably pretty blurry. But what do you see as the distinct differences between appreciation in the creation of art, using other cultural symbols and imagery, or appropriation? Tony?
I'll just do a quick one.
Sure.
I'll start with this quote from the late great comic artist Wally Wood, who said, never draw anything you can copy, never copy anything you can trace, never trace anything you can cut up and paste. But to get away from that very cynical statement, but that, so usually we say we have these really kind of like loose, tenuous definitions of appropriation and appreciation. What is that boundary? And I think that it really is. There's definitely legal boundaries, and as we mentioned, we were talking down before that. it's interesting, you can't copyright recipes, and just like you can't copyright like fashion designs as well, because like the current laws have defined those as being too basic, that they're basic in a sense human needs, clothing and food. So that's, when that is more like common back like when the Oscars were, I think when they happened like was it April? Like March or April? And then there would always be like these things, the knockoffs. You can wear their dress, at your prom or whatever, whatnot. Because they weren't copyrighted, so that you could just like basically just make an exact copy of that. But there are other things like protections, like copyright laws, whatever too. But then when you get into things like with, especially like with the culture indigenous representation, it becomes much more tenuous. It becomes much more almost an individual choice as well, and and it really can also impact all the as the artist. I think also basically when it can impact people's in a sense livelihood, is that's when it can become much more either controversial, or people that can it becomes a harder discussion. What is this? Where are those lines? As Jason says that you can't go back, break things back down, just like you can't copyright a triangle. We have these things like too, where if someone is to see a design on a pot, and then you decide to make some product from that, where does that, can that, and then also or if someone from another, even like from another village is like, oh, I'm gonna like make this Hopi looking pot right now. What is that? Because we see that even there's this folk art market that they have in Santa Fe every year, and you'll see these one artists like from Peru and Ecuador, and they're obviously using Southwest imagery on their pieces, on these board pieces, and it's like, so where, what is that line? Is it appreciation? Is it appropriation? Where is that?
I guess the market has, not that specific market, but the marketplace has a lot to do with that. Susan?
Well, speaking for myself, I've always loved the West and the people in the West. I do cowboys, I do Indians. All my Indian friends call themselves Indians, so excuse me, I'm not saying Native Americans all the time. But I ran a trading post for 5 years up at Marble Canyon in the 70s, and people still wore their traditional clothes, the women did, and the men wore cowboy outfits, really. But I love those people, and they eventually became really good friends, and they started calling me Shema, which means mom in Navajo, or sometimes Digis Peligana, which means crazy white woman. But anyway, I don't feel, I have the background, so I feel like I can show the world. In fact, I just did a little series of small pieces that were turn of the century Navajos, and just old men shaking hands and things like that, just so people can remember what times were like back then. And my friend Kate, who's here today, my Hopi friend, she's been great to me, and get to go up to her mom's house and sit on her uncle's roof and watch the dances. And so I've been part of that too in a small way, but I love the Hopi culture. And I just try to do everything as authentically as I can. And so I don't feel like I'm appropriating anything that much, because I kind of lived it. I don't have an answer for any of you, but I do make a living on it, but at the same time, I feel like I'm contributing. And a lot of Navajo friends used to come in the gallery when I was sculpting at Mountain Trails a lot, and they'd say, oh, thank you for doing this for our people. So that was a real compliment.
Thanks, Susan. Jay?
I think the boundary is probably the dollar sign, and the power dynamic is that, and taking taking from people, taking cultural knowledge, symbols, and making it your own, but then not contributing back into the communities that you're taking the art from, or the culture from, or the symbols from, or the materials that you're taking. I think that has a lot to do with it. I think for most native artists, I won't say all, but maybe I should even say some, in terms of like, using cultural images, language, symbols, ingredients, recipes, fashion, symbols. How are you contributing back to your community by either teaching, sharing your knowledge, sharing language, teaching, working in the community? I think that's also part of it. Then also, how are you contributing monetarily as well too, Are you paying your models? Are you paying them well enough that, you're using their name, image, likeness, as we, that's a new thing in college sports as well too, where people, that power dynamic is shifting also. It just shifted this past year and all that with those things. So, where college students aren't necessarily being taken advantage, but in some ways they still are. So, are you doing that to the native indigenous community that you're appropriating from? And I always use quotations when I say some of those things, like traditional or contemporary. Traditional Santa Clara Pueblo pottery. and appropriation is, again, how are you contributing back to the community you're using? So again, those are those power dynamics, the boundaries of that. And also trading, of working with galleries and having a family that's been working with non-Indian traders, galleries, institutions, etc. over the past, generations. That's probably the easiest thing rather than saying years. And how are you taking advantage or still continuing to being taken advantage, or how are you contributing to one another of 50-50% split, 70-30, 90-10, how are you working together? There's all of those things. So I think that's really a lot of those boundaries and that power dynamic shifting of like, is the person being taken advantage? And then again, the permission part of it, are you asking the permission? Are you required to take permission? And that happens also culturally as well too. Even for my own self of having Native organizations use my work, appropriating my work for banners and things like that, but the fact that they were Native, they should have asked my permission. They did not have my consent to borrow it. So, again, those things aren't just automatic of saying like, oh, well, I'm Native, we're Native, we should love one another. But, there's the permission, and then also your compensation as part of that as well too. So, again, lots of boundaries, lots of lines, lots of power dynamics.
I think those lines are shifting depending on the context, right? Let's move on to the next question. What role does an artist's heritage play in terms of the use of cultural symbols and depictions of lifeways in art? So this comes down to the artist's personal heritage, and what role does that play?
I'd just say a whole hell of a lot. Just for example, I've been just a little bit of work with these other anthropologists who are mostly working on this issue of shamanism and it being appropriated, mostly I guess I'm in the area for that, the New Age of adherence as well. And I was just saying, because it also happens, with other, the North American Native peoples as well, people like there's that thing here, I brought that example up, the sweat lodges, things like that, where that I said it's maybe a tantamount for me attending a Eastern Orthodox ceremony, like if I was in Russia or something, and I was saying, oh, that's pretty cool. And then I would make my own homemade vestments as well, and I would start doing quote unquote baptisms and officiating marriages and such like that as well. I'm not here without having any cultural context about what it really was about, but I really appreciate it. Really appreciated what I saw, and I thought it was beautiful. So I wanted to spread that. So is that really doing that? Is that really showing the respect? As well. But so I think, especially when it comes to with the native sense material and because of, depending on, what from area you're from, or tribe or whatnot, that there are certain like iconography and things that are represented that are very, very culturally specific. And then if you get down even deeper, even like if you want to use that term, the ceremonial specific. And sometimes the things that are, not to be meant or used out of context. And it's also goes to a different, difference of worldview, that there's not this thing as this inherent right to knowledge in many, particularly in Puebloan communities, because that you have to earn that. You have to go through certain stages, either, as you age, or if you want to call it initiations or whatever, but that you basically, and just teachings, and also experiences, that you have to earn to be able to handle this knowledge. That is not something to be, just to be out there, because it could have ramifications for your physical, spiritual, and mental health. So that's why there's responsibility to that knowledge. So that's why I think that that's something that oftentimes people don't realize that because of that cultural context.
Susan?
I did a sculpture of, actually my friend Kate, who's here today, and she gave me a photograph that her dad had taken of her at the Butterfly Girl ceremony. And I couldn't go there and take photographs, it's not permitted. But I was working on it in the gallery, and a nice Hopi man came in and he said, well, she's Butterfly Girl, how come there's no butterflies? So I said, well, I didn't want to do any without making sure they were Hopi-style butterflies. So he went home and drew me butterflies and sent them to me. And I used them all around the base of the piece. And then I felt good about the whole piece. And I don't feel like I broke any rules, really. So that's kind of how I feel about it all. But I know it's a difficult in-between thing, so.
Jim?
Just probably just agree with Tony in terms of ditto of having certain knowledge and the ability to create certain things, or having that right, or being part of the community, that what is culturally sensitive and insensitive, I guess, in that sense. So I think those are some of those things of having that cultural knowledge, of being able to know what you can or cannot create in that sense, or even knowledge of sharing too, of that. Even we, within our own communities, we have certain knowledge that we share amongst other community members, or we don't even have that right to understand any of those things, because we're not part of a certain group or a certain society, or however, or we might not have that knowledge allowed to us. Even gender has part of that to do with too. So there's things as the table man that I don't know, or I will never have the knowledge of, that maybe my mothers or aunts or ceremonial mothers type things have knowledge of. So again, that has a huge role in what you create and how you share.
Just real quick.
Sure.
I guess, one of the most big examples of appropriation of, if you want to call it a native symbol, to look at the swastika.
Yes.
Exactly. So, so when the National Socialists, appropriated that image, because one thing they're saying is that it came from, Indus, civilization, in the Indian continent as well, from the Aryan groups there, but also it's probably also seen on Native American imagery with these all-American Indians, because of the Karl May as well. Because before the 30s, the swastika, especially in this country, was seen as an Indian symbol.
Yes.
That basically if you wanted to show something that this is Indian, was what you could use a swastika, an arrowhead, things like that, or a thunderbird. Those were all common across the board. You could buy silver spoons with a swastika at the bottom. You get what's called the whirling log symbol, on both of them. Then you would see it on textiles as well. And then oftentimes they're reversed as well. It's going in the other direction as the Nazi version. So then that's a big example of appropriating something without and then certainly like twisting certainly the meaning that originally was behind it. So yeah, that it can sometimes go really go sideways.
I think another one, and it's not so historically loaded, is like the Zia symbol, which everybody's familiar with in New Mexico. That originated from the Pueblo of Zia, and obviously it's everywhere, all over official New Mexico state, everything. However, I did notice recently that the Pueblo of Zia has started licensing that image to several different companies. There's one called Organ Mountain Outfitters out of Las Cruces, and they are officially licensed by the Pueblo of Zia, all proceeds from their, so that's a great example. I think the proceeds go to supporting educational initiatives at the Pueblo of Zia. So that's a great example, I think, of a company kind of responsibly appropriating that symbol, but in a consensual way.
Yes, the woman who designed the Mexico state flag, which actually is a good one because it's not just like putting the seal and then putting it on a flag, which becomes unreadable when it's really small. But she used this one Zia pot as inspiration on it, and that's so it literally did come from a Zia piece.
Right. Okay, so we got about 5 minutes left, I think, before we need to go to Q&A. So I'd like to give you guys an opportunity for some concluding thoughts about the topic and hit on any of the things. We didn't get to talk about galleries and consumers' responsibilities when selling and purchasing Indigenous art, or who's harmed by the use or misuse of Native imagery and art. So you can touch on any of those or any other concluding thoughts that you may have for the program today, and then we'll go to some Q&A. Tony?
That's hard.
Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to go for another kind of like way out there example. Are you familiar with this? This one, he was a singer, songwriter, Solomon Linda. He's from South Africa. Way back when he recorded with his group a song called Mbube. And it's largely using vocables, and at the very end, he does this falsetto leap, right when the record's ending, that the world would forever known as the lyrics would go, in the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. And so this record, got some play, but he eventually, he died, largely unknown, and then certainly struggled financially most of his life. And but the record made it in this region, and then I think it was Pete Seeger's group did a version of it. They, again, because they didn't quite understand what it was saying, they called it Wimoe.
Oh, yeah.
And then also the late Alan Arkin had a folk group. They did another, really, I guess, a very nice version of that as well, Wimoe. And I guess what Seeger would do, he would actually, because again, they didn't know who wrote it, and they just had that like scratchy record. So then he would like to save money aside for royalties, even though he didn't know where they were going to. And then even though it wasn't even required to do that as well, because they changed it enough, what is it, like 10%, to make it a new composition. So then they becomes that, quote unquote rock and roll song, with full lyrics and whatnot. And then The Lion King comes out as well. It becomes becoming more popular, just making all this money for the original songwriters, but not for Solomon Linda or his estate, until someone finally figures it out. And then, then they realize it too, that this is his composition, this is his recording. So they're trying to work through courts, but they're saying, not too much time has passed. But finally, people start to realize, there's a responsibility to this. Certainly, other artists have responsibility to other artists as well. So they start, again, the company starts building these record labels, they're forcing them to you got to build up these royalties, and then overnight, then their accounts get deposited. This is through wire transfer, so it's back, not as fast. Their whole situation changes overnight, because people realize, what was the most responsible, you can call it the right thing, certainly responsible, you can call it ethical, but basically recognizing an artist's work.
Thanks, Tony. It's a great example. Susan, some final
I
thoughts?
really don't have anything more to say
Okay.
about that.
Jay?
Yeah, I think, like what Tony said, just do the right thing of what is in the best interest of who you're borrowing from, who you're appropriating, who you're stealing from, however you define it, really. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And, of having someone to know of the fact that we know who his name is now, and, the family, maybe he didn't have the time to appreciate, his newfound wealth from the appreciation for his work, but, his family did. And sometimes those are some of those things too, as we work, this is to benefit our family too as well. Again, that power dynamic of how does it benefit, our communities, how does it benefit our families, how does it benefit the individual, but then also how does it benefit our communities in the future as well. Stuff like that of Zia Pueblo creating, or going to court, getting the licensing, trademarking it, saying this is ours, you have to pay us or reimburse us, however you're compensating us, and then them putting it towards their education program or their scholarship program. So I think those are a lot of those things too. And I think that's, again, just do the right thing. What's in your heart, what's in your mind. So.
Great, thanks.
And your pocketbook.
But again, I urge you to go and watch the first panel, which really did focus on galleries and consumers' responsibilities when it comes to, if you're interested in purchasing authentic, legitimate, indigenous art, there's legislation that protects you, protects the artist, protects the consumers as well. And so it wasn't so much the focus here. But, I think going to art markets is great, meeting those artists face to face that's really, I think, it not only really assures you as a consumer that you're purchasing a piece of legitimate native art, but then you have the opportunity to build a relationship with that artist and learn about the community that artist is coming from. Learn something about the artist's family. And then, a lot of these artists, they go to the markets year after year after year, and you be able to really build a relationship, which to me is a much more valuable experience than having a pretty piece of jewelry, right? Is that connection with a member of another community, with another culture. So, go ahead.
I'll give a quick adding to that. So I know, probably the best place is a source. Going to the native artists, Pueblo artists. I know the Museum of Northern Arizona has a show, I believe, in the summertime. I know you have different shows like the Zuni, Hopi, Navajo show. And then now there's just one. I believe it's in July, is that correct?
It's June 20.
June?
22nd.
June 22nd, so check out that. First weekend of March, the Herd Museum will be having their show, and I'll be there. Tony will be there as well too. And other native artists, especially many here in Arizona. Santa Fe Indian Market, put on by SWAIA, is happening August 19, 20-ish in that weekend. Then there's also another show, the Pathways by the Pole Cultural Art Museum, that's happening in Milwaukee, Buffalo Thunder. There's also Free Indian Market, as they call it, happening in Santa Fe. And then there's also some really great galleries here in the state as well too, that, they really work with a lot of the artists, and, they compensate them well, they're not taking advantage. But then there are also other ones that are not. So, and we can probably name a couple.
Well, let me name another legitimate one. If you don't want to come out for the August prices as well, but you can come to Santa Fe for Memorial Day weekend for Native Treasures at the Santa Fe Convention Center, which benefits the Museum of Indian Arts and Cultures.
Yes,
Nice plug right there. Yeah, yeah. So lots of opportunities to not only purchase legitimate native art, but also build connections and relations. Yes, Susan.
Mark Sublet, who has Medicine Man Gallery, and used to be in Santa Fe, but he's in Tucson now. And every day on Instagram, he talks about a different piece of pottery or a different basket. He really is an expert about native art. So if you ever get to Tucson and go in his gallery, you'll be amazed. So that's another good source.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, but we'll hang around for a little while. We could, I think, talk about this the rest of the day, but thank you all so very much for coming. We really appreciate it. Don't forget the reflection pages on your way out. A quick thank you to Corey Begay, who is the Navajo artist who developed the page, and thank you all again.